Started.
Okay.
Greetings and salutations, everybody at the Rocky Mountain chapter of the Society for American Baseball Research. I'm your vice president and host for this evening, where our guest of honor is Will Bardenwerper, an American writer specializing in narrative nonfiction. He's the author of The Prisoner in His Palace, Saddam Hussein, His American Guards, and What History Leaves Unsaid, as well as a book that just came out on Monday, a book that I just finished a couple days ago and I'm going to be raving about for the next hour. It's called Homestand, Small Town Baseball, and the Fight for the Soul of America from Doubleday Books. On sale everywhere you get books. Will, how you doing today, buddy?
Good, good. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you taking out time to join us and to talk about this fantastic book. It's published by Doubleday Books, and I don't know if you know this or not, founded by Frank Nelson Doubleday, whose grandson, Nelson Doubleday Jr., was a co-owner of the New York Mets from 86 to 2002. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe they're also both men are descendants of Abner Doubleday of Cooperstown, New York, the so-called creator of the sport.
Well, I happen to know the first part of that, in that I'm a Mets fan, and so yeah, I was familiar with the Doubleday connection to the Mets, and I had kind of maybe surmised that there could be a relation with Abner, but I had not, I wasn't sure about that part.
Yeah. That's pretty funny. Yeah, I you mentioned the Mets thing, and that's kind of where I almost wanted to get started. Is can you share the story of where you were October 19th, 2006, Game 7 of the NLCS, and if you want to include your thoughts on Adam Wainwright and Carlos Beltran, feel free.
Oh yeah, well, I guess to back up a tiny bit, because I grew up in DC, and so a lot of people ask, are you a Nationals fan? And first thing I'll say is, well, the Nationals weren't there when I was growing up, and so most of us were Oriole fans. That was the closest team, and that was kind of when they were, had in the mid '80s when I was a kid, Cal Ripken Jr., the World Series. They had some real fun, successful teams back then. But fast forward to when I got out of college, I was living in Manhattan in the late 90s. And that was with the Bobby Valentine Mets and, a real scrappy sort of bunch of colorful, charismatic underdogs that, were pretty successful. Usually the Braves would end up beating us at the end, but we had some good fights over the years. The first Subway Series took place then. 9/11 happened. Baseball was kind of a great way to pull the city together, through those tough times. The Yankee dynasty was going on. So it was just a fun time to be a baseball fan in New York. So I kind of really grew to love the Mets, went to a lot of their games out at Shea Stadium. I ended up joining the military after 9/11, like a week later. I was kind of inspired by the fire department, the police department, and different forms of service, and ultimately chose to serve in the military, which brought me to Iraq in 2006. And we were stationed in kind of a remote outpost to the northwest of Ramadi. It was a pretty violent year and a violent part of the country in one of the more violent years of the war. So not a ton of great memories from that experience, but one of the fun things that we did, there was a friend of mine who was a really passionate St. Louis Cardinals fan. I'm, of course, a Mets fan. And the games, it's like a 6 or 8 hour time difference. They're ahead. And so, the 8 o'clock Eastern time starts would be like, 2 or 3 in the morning there. And we would wake up and watch them on the Armed Forces Network. And, when they won, it was great. You didn't really sleep because that would lead kind of right into breakfast and the next day. When they won, you kind of rode that high, into the next day. When they lost, you were just like, well, I should have just slept. I didn't get anything out of this other than frustration and fatigue. And yeah, that last game, we came up short. The Cardinals, did they go on? They went, I think they won the World Series that year, right? They certainly made it to the World Series because they beat us. And so, to this day, that Cardinal fan, sometimes gives me a hard time about how they prevailed. But yeah, that's where I was watching the Mets.
Yeah, that again shows your dedication to being a Mets fan. It's funny because in reading this book, you talk a lot about your family, And I thought I knew where your daughter's name, Shay, came from.
Uh,
And I also thought, well, maybe there was a minor league outfield prospect in the early 2000s named Fletcher Bates. And I thought, man, this guy is really a hardcore Mets
no.
fan. Not exactly that. I don't know if you want to tell everyone where the names come from, but or that's something you got to read the book for, right?
No, they're both family names. Bates has no connection to baseball. Shay, I'm not gonna lie, like that was a added bonus. It's more of a family name, O'Shea. Like my mom's side of the family, Irish. We just dropped the O, but the connection to Shea Stadium might have played a minor role in my thinking, at least.
And I think Chipper Jones would have used the name first, right? Did that kind of give you pause a little bit that,
Yeah.
do I want my daughter to have the same name as Chipper Jones's daughter in Shay?
It's funny. My one of the guys I've been working with more recently is a big Braves fan, and I was just going back. I think he mentioned the 1999 NLCS against the Braves, and I had kind of forgotten about it a little bit. Maybe I just kind of blocked it out, and I went back and looked at those games, and all those names were coming back to me. John Rocker and Eddie Perez, who was I think the MVP of the series, as essentially like a backup role player, and he just killed us. So yeah, it was a trip, like many trips on Mets memory lane. It didn't end well, but
Yeah, that train has still left the seventh station, and with Stephen A. Cohen. Do you sort of feel like, again, you can't read the tea leaves entirely or have a crystal ball, but as a Mets fan, do you feel like, you know what? I think we've got the owner that is going to get the job done and help us win the first World Series since '86?
I mean, he might if someone's going to do it, I think it would be him. As I'm sure we'll get to a little bit. Like I have very conflicted feelings about Major League Baseball in general now, and sort of the economic model and what that portends to the future of the sport. But, I guess if those are the rules that we're playing with, I'd rather win than lose. I guess, we have we're well positioned to do that now. But the book, researching the book was kind of, it was, what's the word? I had mixed feelings about it because it kind of removed, it's kind of like seeing behind the curtain, of the wizard, and you kind of have these romantic visions and then you kind of see how the sausage is really made and it can be kind of disillusioning. So, yeah, so we'll see how it plays out.
I think that leads into the start of your book, your epigraph. You've got a passage from F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, that references the Black Sox scandal in 1919. I was curious why that was used and if it was ultimately because, in 1919 with the World Series being thrown there by the White Sox, if that was kind of, one of the first moments in the sport's history where the soul of baseball was lost, much like with the reduction of the minor leagues.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it hopefully got at a little bit at least was this, the kind of the maybe the disconnect between what the sport I think historically has kind of meant, in the American imagination and maybe the reality of what it is today. Maybe it always has been, but I think maybe more so today. And this the tension kind of between, well, the one argument would be, well, it's capitalism. It's they cut, if they want to get rid of a minor league team that they're spending $700,000 to support, that's their money. They can do what they want. They're running a business. And, I get that. Obviously, legally, they're and completely entitled to do that. I think what bothered me a little more was the fact that, they've at least always held themselves up as something that transcended, just business. They don't just make widgets or tires or, vacuum cleaners. They're kind of, they occupy a more exalted, place in our society. And they've leveraged that, through marketing. If you turn on the World Series, a lot of times they'll do a montage of, a kid playing catch with his dad in a cornfield, kind of this Norman Rockwell, you know, vision. And so I guess I'm just kind of trying to say you can't, it just, I don't feel like it's fair to have it both ways. On the one hand, you purport to be one thing, but then you kind of, make decisions that are going to really negatively impact, 40 small towns across America that have been supporting you for the last 100 years, and just kind of leave them behind. So it's that disconnect that I think that I found to be troublesome.
Yeah, that is a great summation of the fact that in Major League Baseball, they are the purveyors of the sport. And
Hmm.
this story, homestand, small town baseball, and the fight for the soul of America, which I read using a minor league baseball card of the mascot for the Rockies High A affiliate, the Spokane Indians. It isn't just about the 2023 season for the Batavia Muck Dogs, one of those 43 teams who is wiped off the mat. It was your writing is absolutely fantastic, and it really made me feel familiar with everyone that was in that story, and very emotional in the final 30 pages in the book. You do a great job weaving in, imagery of your own life and your grandfather watching you play, talking about Betsy and Ginny, and driving those 45 minutes at the beginning in the middle of winter, to get a glimpse and to get a taste of what the 2023 season is going to be like. I'm sort of curious what it's like writing about real people, and
Hmm.
how do they respond. I'm a journalist. I read about the Rockies, but I'm not critical of anyone. I don't think you are either, but
Hmm.
I might avoid maybe more than I should. I'll say that, and be
Hmm.
honest, certain sore subjects, whereas
Hmm.
you deal with those things very delicately. But I'm
Hmm.
curious about how people, when they read about themselves, which you've been doing
Yeah.
this for a long time, and some amazing articles
Hmm.
covering this subject and so many more. What is their response like about their
Hmm.
recollections of what transpired?
Yeah, and I mean that's a very important question, and it's one of the hardest parts of, this business of if it's like a long form magazine article or a book that is dependent on, having people welcome you into their lives. And it's even more tricky than like covering professional athletes because those are all public figures. They're making tons of money. Like if, you're probably not going to lose a ton of sleep if one of them gets upset. But, these are just regular people that I'm writing about. And so I am sensitive to the fact that, I'm dependent on them to allow me to tell their story. They're not, getting anything out of it other than hopefully, someone bringing, their experiences to life, which, they may or may not even want, at the beginning of the process. And so I guess what I would say to you and what I kind of try to say to them is, first of all, like I'm not just kind of gonna parachute in for like 3 days and leave. You see some journalists do that, and they kind of come in with like a pre-cooked idea. They sort of come in, snatch it, and leave. Like I say, listen, I'm going to do the very best I can to really get to know you, to get to know the community, and to over time, hopefully, get at an accurate understanding of what's going on, and then communicate that as fairly as I can. You know, I think I try to be very transparent that, I am obviously a writer. I have a notebook and a pen out most of the time. So it's clear to them that I'm taking notes. I try not to blindside anyone but even so, when because these aren't interviews. It's more just I'm hanging out, for like, hours in the bleachers or at a coffee shop or whatever. And so, it's just kind of natural that you become closer to them, than you would just like a typical person you interview for like half an hour. Um, and so I'm still sensitive to maybe, well, when they said that, did they really intend for that to be in a book, or were they just saying that because we've been hanging out for 2 hours, And so, um, again, like all I can really tell them is I'm going to try to be as honest as I can. I'm not going to go out of my way to reveal things that are going to like embarrass you in any way. But at the same time, I can't just like just gloss over stuff, then I'd just lose all credibility and the book wouldn't be any good. Like just to give you an example, like today, I got a text message from the owner of the team, Robbie, who's a prominent character in the book, and it was like all caps. He's like, "Please call me!" Exclamation point. And I'm like, "Oh shit!" Like he just got the book, and now, what, I quickly started thinking like, what could he be really upset about? And there wasn't a lot, but there were a few things in there that were, about his family and his wife's challenging upbringing, and I kind of suggest that he's a little on the cheap side when it comes to certain things, even though I think the overall portrait of him is very positive, but it's not like 100% positive. So I was like, shoot, like, I was kind of nervous. And it turns out, he's halfway through it and he loves it and he wanted to find out how he could buy 20 copies to give to his friends and everything. So it was fine, but it just shows that, that anxiety is still always there because you kind of feel like you you don't want these people to regret having you around. I guess is one way of saying it.
Yeah, there was definitely, I didn't find there was anything inflammatory
Hmm.
about any of the people in the book. And even like you said, okay, he can be the owner can be a little bit frugal, but you also understand why, because you've
Hmm.
outlined so many other things. Because again, you're not just dropping in, you've really
Hmm.
entrenched yourself, going to the pub coffee hub and just
Hmm.
all of these different, you became a part of their family in the summer. And
Hmm.
anyone who is at that ballpark and a part of the Batavia Muck Dogs does become, part of that family, and that's very very clear in this book. The thing that you do well, besides just that piece, the hey, what is it like to follow a team for an entire summer, is because this is a summer collegiate baseball team. So one of the 43 teams that I think it was part of the New York Penn League, one
Hmm.
of the short season leagues that were available when players first got drafted. And there's a lot of notable players that have come through the Batavia Muck Dogs, but now it's a summer collegiate league. We've got a couple of those in Colorado, the Rocky Mountain Collegiate Baseball League, Mile High Collegiate Baseball. So, but it's very different, right? It's a different breed of game altogether.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's one of the things Robbie may not have been thrilled about, but I'm honest about the fact that, the quality of baseball is not the same. You can't tell me that what you're watching now in these leagues, like I mean, there's some elite leagues like the Cape Cod League and stuff that is like top tier D1 guys that are all going to get drafted. But in this case, it's like a lot of, mid-tier Division 1, Division 3, maybe one guy on the team's breaking 90, there's like 3 home runs a season, whereas in the old Appalachian League that I wrote about for Harper's, there were games where it was Jacob deGrom pitching against Noah Syndergaard. Both guys are throwing 100 miles an hour in Bluefield, West Virginia. And so, there's no doubt that those communities are just not seeing the same kind of talent that they saw before. Now, the flip side of that is that, to the extent that some of these communities have resurrected baseball in the form of these college teams, it still provides, that sense of community. It gives people a place to go, over the course of the summer for an affordable price with their friends and their neighbors, and to find sort of that camaraderie that was, one of the most important parts of the experience in the first place. So it's not all bad, but where I get nervous is like where MLB will sometimes say, well, you know, there hasn't really been any loss. It doesn't matter. Like whatever is there now is just it's not the wrong kind of baseball for them. It's just like a different kind of baseball, and they're just as well off. And my kind of the analogy that I would sometimes make to that is, well, that's like saying, well, we're going to take a wonderful, steakhouse out of your community. We're going to replace it with like a greasy burger shop, and just because people go to the burger shop because they like some kind of meat and that's all there is now, that's not evidence that they're just as well off as they were when they had the steakhouse. It's better than nothing, but they probably were still better having what they had before than what they are left with.
I'm wondering if, and I wouldn't say you're heavy-handed at all in criticism of Major League Baseball, but one of the questions I had written down was just this idea that, do you feel that minor league baseball and with that independent baseball summer collegiate wood bats league, like, do they get the game of baseball better and the fan experience better than Major League Baseball right now? And again, we're in an area right now where we lost the Pioneer League. There was a team just down the road from Denver in the Colorado Springs Sky Sox, the first ever AAA affiliate from the Rockies. They went from 2018 being on the top rung of the minor league ladder to being on the bottom rung in short season ball to not existing once 2020 rolled around. I'm curious if it feels like, again, the soul of baseball is more with the minor leagues than it is on the business side with Major League Baseball.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be some truth to that. And then also just thought I'd note just to your listeners, like when this book first like began as an idea, I was living in Denver and actually lived in a building that was, if you could hit a 700-foot home run, you would hit my apartment building. It was right across beyond the left field fence of Coors Field. You could see, if you're in Coors Field, behind home plate, and you look up, like down the line, you can see like the roof deck of this apartment, which is where we lived. So the Rockies, I'm a Mets fan, but the Rockies always have like a little bit of a soft spot for them. I love Charlie Blackmon and Arenado and, the players that were playing out there when I was there. But yeah, to answer your question, I do think that that there is something kind of special about baseball at that level that is less accessible now at the major league level than maybe I think that gap is more dramatic than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I'm actually trying to get an essay in one of the newspapers here about that I've been working on. I don't know what's going to come of it, but I tell this story of kind of like your typical story of we were hanging out outside PNC Park. We live outside Pittsburgh now, 1 or 2 summers ago, and it was for the Mets. And I knew like where the players leave to get on the bus, and I'd seen them out there before. So I bring my son, who's like 5. I'll say, "Hey, let's get an autograph," and all the players just like walk by and no one gives an autograph. And I was like, this is kind of a bummer. And then I stepped back and I was like, well, these guys probably get pestered a lot, and I should be more forgiving. Like, they have a lot on their mind or whatever. But then I stepped back again and I'm like, well, wait a second. Like Francisco Lindor, I did the math. He made $230,000 that afternoon, like for one game. He had, literally, if you do the math on a $34 million a year contract and then break it down by game and by inning, the numbers are like staggering. And it got me to thinking about, the book, The Boys of Summer by Roger Kahn, the famous book about the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he talks about, these players a few years after they retired, and he would find like, all-star, if not Hall of Fame caliber players, like working construction or tending bar, and I don't think anyone would suggest that, if you're the best in the world at something, you should probably have to be working construction after you retire. I don't think that's right either. But I think the pendulum has swung so far to this other extreme, and these players are now inhabiting a world that is like not even the same planet that most of us are on. And so I think it's inevitable that some part of that connection between player and fan is going to just kind of get lost. And like you said, at the minor league level and at the college level for sure, um, that's not the case. These were just in the case of Batavia, like it was just cool because these were like the little kids loved it because they could get autographs. They didn't know the difference between Bryce Harper and some Division III guy that was signing. It's just a cool looking guy in a neat uniform that's signing your autograph. They could run on the field. They could play catch before the game. There was like this connection that developed between the players and the fans, and the players loved it too because half of them had probably never had anyone ask for their autograph before, and now they were like celebrities, and so it was like this really cool, sort of symbiotic thing. And I just don't think you're going to see that anymore, just because professional sports have just become just like the scale of it is now just so different than it ever has been.
Yeah, the word customer service comes to mind in the major leagues, and some teams, will do it better than others. The Rockies
Mhm.
do a good job, and a
Mhm.
lot of
Yeah, they
teams
do. I will
might.
say the Rocky like ushers, like I went to church at just right there was a little place near us, and it was largely Latin, Spanish speakers, but they totally like welcomed us. And one of the guys there was a Rockies usher, and we got to know him, and it was really cool because we would, don't tell anyone this on the Rockies, but yeah, we would we'd buy like the cheapest ticket possible in the nosebleeds, and then his section was like right behind home plate, and he would always just like give us like a third row seat at Coors Field. So no, but he was all of the people there I thought were like super super nice.
The names and genders have been changed for that story, so there you go. Now you don't know what usher that was,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, teams, will sometimes have their appointed customer service time. The nice thing, if anyone does go down to spring training, we're in that time of year. As of the recording on March 12th, the Rockies will have, a 15-minute session before every game where there will be two players, signing out there. And for the first game of spring training this year, they had two of their top prospects, including Chase Dollander, who's, battling for a spot in the rotation. So they do a good job of that customer service at certain times, whereas 24/7, these guys who, are part of people's families, they're at the game, as you said, you can reach out and touch them and they're going to communicate. There is a much better customer service, I think, at the minor league level. I think throughout minor leagues, and particularly in the case of Batavia, as you mentioned with Denver, there are some Easter eggs throughout this book for anyone who's a Rockies fan, or if you're in the Rocky Mountain region. There's a reference to John Elway in there. There's a young man who plays for the Muck Dogs named Nolan Sparks,
Oh
who was
yeah.
raised in Denver, drafted in 2024. plays for a team you might not want to root for, but go check that out. Go read the book. You'd also talk about the second man ever elected to Cooperstown in Rockies history. No, not Todd Helton. Yes, Jim Leland. He was
Hmm.
actually the second. Rockies legend Daniel Descalso gets a mention. You have some excerpts from Bull Durham creator Ron Shelton's and his somewhat harsh take on Commissioner Rob Manfred. Your family has a connection to Manny Ramirez, and so
Hmm.
many incredible statistics. We all love statistics here. Just going into how many minor league teams there were in 1949 and how there's just a fraction of those that still exist now. American born black players, how many of them were around on opening day rosters in 1991 and how much it's shrunk going into the opening day of 2023. So you hit on sabermetrics, and that word also even appears in there. So again, a lot of really great Easter eggs throughout this. I'm wondering if at a certain point for you, because again, this is only partially a story about that community, but it's also how baseball has changed and how minor league baseball
Hmm.
has changed. I wonder if you had to stop yourself with some of the rabbit holes because you do an
Hmm.
amazing job of telling like the modern story and the history of baseball and checking off so many different boxes with the Astros sign stealing, the Field of Dreams game, like so many different things. Did you have to almost pause yourself at a certain point, or as a writer, you got to go down every avenue and extinguish every, possible outcome that you could possibly uncover?
Yeah, I mean that was a very tricky thing to do because you're right. Like, I mean, there's so many different directions you could go, and any of those ones you just mentioned, you could write, like at least a few chapters, if not like your own book on that. And yet you can't kind of lose your sort of narrative momentum of, this summer, this story, these people to go on like a 45-page detour on, the evolution of talent development, and but at the same time, like a lot of these were important issues that should at least, kind of demanded at least to be addressed in one way or another. And so, yeah, like, I would try to address them, but to do it as, I don't want to say quickly, but to do it in a way that like you weren't, the reader wouldn't feel like they were uh, taking too long of a detour and for kind of forget where they were, in the overall story. So there was a little bit of a balancing act that I had to do there. Definitely some areas where I could have gone on, for a lot longer. And maybe some of your, group would have appreciated that because it's stuff that's super important to you. But like your average reader that doesn't know that much about baseball would be like, well, I don't really want to read 30 pages about like, what happens when the draft gets cut from 40 rounds to 20 rounds, or, how important is it that an organization has this many minor league teams versus that many teams, what happens if college baseball replaces minor league, like there's all these things that are very interesting, especially to baseball fans. But, I had to also keep in mind that not all my readers would, be as interested in some of that stuff.
Yeah, you did a great job with creating that connective tissue with the
Mm.
things that are going on in the game and how it does relate to this, small community and how the game has changed and how it is impacted, 43 different cities around, the US because of minor league baseball shrinking down. Did anybody from the town kind of communicate to you like how much harder it was losing the minor league affiliate in 2021, considering, again, as I mentioned with the Sky Sox, you go from we're alive in 2019, the pandemic hits, there's no minor league season, and now, sorry, but in the game of musical chairs, there's no chair for you. So you never get that opportunity to actually say goodbye to that thing that it's been for a very long time, still there, but in a completely different capacity.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what happened. And just to frame that, through my experience, like, it was the fall of 2019, when these rumors began to float. And at that point, our family, we had moved from the apartment by Coors Field down to near was it Washington Park, not too far from there. We were just renting a house down there, and I remember I was at a coffee shop, when I first read that, and I thought to myself, this doesn't seem like it's going to end well for these 40 towns. And I played baseball all the way through 2 years of college. I was familiar enough with it to know what these teams meant to these places. And so I had put together what I thought was a good proposal to do a book that was going to take me to tell the story of the last season of the Appalachian League, because they were one of the leagues that was rumored to be, that was going to get cut. But at that point, they were going to play like that final season. And I just thought that'd be a really cool way to like chronicle the final season and explain what it had meant for like a century and what was being lost. And then, of course, we all remember what happened winter of 2020, January, February, March is when COVID first emerged, really. And, I remember every day I'd check and I'd be looking at like the case numbers and the different lockdown restrictions that different states were doing. And kind of just kept hoping that, somehow this would go away and we'd still have baseball that summer. But, it looked progressively worse until eventually, they did cancel that entire season at the minor league level. And then, not too long after that, they made the announcement that these teams had all been cut. And so you're right. I mean, there was never even a chance to say goodbye. Luckily, someone read this whole book basically resulted from the fact that someone read that article. I ended up sort of salvaging all that research in the form of that Harper's article that talks about what the Appalachian League had been and what was lost, even though I didn't have a chance to go down and like watch the games myself. And someone read the article and reached out to me just through my website. And he was a gentleman that I write about in this book, Bill Kaufman, who lives in Batavia. He's a writer himself. And he said, your book or your article, really resonated. It reminded me so much of the experience that we have here going to Muck Dogs games. I'd love to get together. I'd love to buy you a beer, just talk baseball. And Batavia is only about 4 hours from Pittsburgh. And so I figured, okay, why not? I jumped in the car a few weeks later and went up and met him. He introduced me to some of his fellow Muck Dog fans, and kind of one thing led to another. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe there's a story here, in that, it captures a lot of the same themes of what was lost in Appalachia, but they've developed something new, and it's just a really colorful. I was just struck by like how colorful the people were, how welcoming they were, and how much baseball meant to their lives, and that's kind of what led to this book.
Kind of coincidental that on this day 5 years ago, the Rockies canceled their game. It might have been against the Mariners, but they canceled the game right at the beginning of COVID. And then I can remember March 13th, I was still a high school teacher at that
Oh,
point.
is that
And
minor league? Their minor. I mean, their spring training game. Is that what you're
spring
saying?
training was
Yeah, yeah,
ended,
yeah.
and that was obviously the start. I think it was March 11th would have been Rudy Gobert and everything happening in Utah
Ah,
at the Jazz game, and so we're right now at that 5 year mark where it kind of all
yeah.
went down. And I can remember on March 13th saying to everyone as all the teachers at my high school packed up, for we're just gonna be gone a couple weeks. I said to everyone, kind of half joking, I'll see you next year,
Wow.
next school year. And sure enough, yeah, we didn't come back that year, and some people did come back in the fall of the next year and try to make it work. Others went to online schooling and things of that nature, and the rest is history
Wow.
from there. But yeah, five
Yeah.
years ago, essentially to today,
Yeah, you're right.
was
You're right.
COVID and the death of minor league baseball.
And yeah, I mean it's bad memory lane. I remember because I was skiing, I had the, season ski pass. I was out in like Breckenridge or Vail or something. And I remember being on the lift, like yeah, right around here, like early March, and there were a bunch of guys from Boston. And I remember, I was just listening in on the conversation, and they were saying, yeah, we flew here from Boston, and yeah, there's this thing called COVID, and yeah, it shouldn't be a big, deal. We'll fly home. And like a week later, like the mountain closed, and that was the last time I skied that year. And I think the next year might have opened up, but yeah, everything hit like a tidal wave right around this time. You're right.
What are your thoughts on we talk about, the how Batavia was able to salvage a life, after being a minor league affiliate. I can remember them in the 90s and 2000s being associated with the Phillies. They, of course, were, around even before then. But thoughts on teams that also, another former Wood Bat League team, the Savannah Bananas. Do you feel like a team like them, which very much like a minor league team in their ethos, obviously, what they're doing for the game of baseball?
I mean, yeah, they're a cool story. I actually interviewed their owner or creator, whatever you want to call him, for this. I didn't write about him in the book, but I did talk to him. And I think, it's a big tent, and it's the more people you can get into the game, the better. I do think though that like I think there's a fine line between, at least for baseball. I mean, I don't even think they present themselves as just baseball. I mean, they're something different. They're like entertainment, and I don't think he would dispute that. I think that you don't want to, for at least the baseball fan, you don't want to go too overboard to just becoming just over the top, where all of a sudden it doesn't even resemble baseball anymore. And I do think that like some of the fans, you know, there's a happy medium, I think, where you can appeal to sort of the baseball purist, kind of the old school fans that are there for the baseball, and they don't really care about the pageantry. They don't care about the crazy promotions that take place between innings. They're just there to see the baseball, and they're the ones that were probably the most impacted by contraction because the quality of the players, which was what was most important to them, has been lost, and the ability to track people as they rise up, through the ranks. And that's something that was, meaningful to a lot of those fans. Then you have your other basket of fans who are kind of just more there for a good time, a place to bring their kids, to mingle, to socialize. The fact that the guy's throwing 88 versus 94 may not be super important to them. And, they're more probably also, the sort of the goofy gimmicks and stuff that have historically been part of minor league baseball. That's probably more, that would appeal more to them. And so I think, some mix of that is the perfect sweet spot because you it's not so crazy that like, you alienate the purists, but there's enough fun stuff to keep the kids interested. Like I think the best example of that I actually saw in the course of my summer, because I went to other minor league games too, just as a fan, and I talk about it in the book. I brought my son to a Kannapolis game, which I think is what is it? High A, not double A, might have been high A, down in North Carolina. But in any case, they have like a beautiful ballpark, lots of grassy areas. They have bouncy houses kids can play in, craft beer areas, good food, funny little zany things between innings. But it's also like super great quality baseball. And so that's like, I think that was like the sweet spot of good baseball, good time, a little bit of everything. I think the Bananas obviously go to one big extreme, which is good for that, but I don't think that's like the answer for baseball writ large.
That was one of my more favorite parts of the book, where you go out and kind of see how the pros do it, quote unquote, for what are now the Kannapolis Cannonballers,
Yeah.
but previously the Kannapolis Intimidators,
Mhm.
named after Dale Earnhardt, who was a part of that ownership group, and how NASCAR kind of did something similar to what
Yeah.
Major
Yeah.
League Baseball did, and how that backfired in a lot of different ways. So
Mhm.
again, the way you're able to weave that story, I think, was fantastic in informing and talking about how the game has changed in a lot of ways. There's one line in there that I think that was really curious. That curious might not be the right word, but I can remember from my own personal story when there was a time when Alex Rodriguez got popped for PEDs.
Mhm.
Like the best player in the game was using, and it was at a time in which it seemed like less and less guys were using it. There were less of those rumors. The testing was more plentiful, but it made me just it broke my heart because it was like, if this guy's doing it, I mean, what does that mean for everyone else? And I love my baseball history, and it felt like, well, now when I talk about the greats of the 90s,
Mhm.
it can be kind of poo-pooed away because, well, sure, this guy had more home runs than that guy from the 50s or 60s, but we know he might have been using
Mhm.
something. My uncle, who was a Mets fan and still is, he swore off baseball after the strike and the lockout from 94 to 95. And so like baseball has this way of really hurting the ones that love it the most. And the
Mhm.
line that jumps out to me from the book, and as you said, you've got these mixed emotions, was, quote, wearing my Mets cap now makes me feel like an accomplice to an enterprise I feel guilty supporting.
Yeah, I mean, I was, surprised by the extent to which you put it the exactly right as far as like burning the people that were the most loyal. Because I mean, some of the people I got to know in the course of the article and the book, were just, the most passionate baseball fans you could imagine. I mean, the one I talked to one guy in North Carolina, he was a season ticket holder for the Burlington, North Carolina minor league team, which I think most recently was with the affiliated with the Royals. And uh, and then Elon University, the Durham Bulls, and like a fourth team. So he was going to like, season ticket holder to four different things. And then of course was like a rabid MLB fan and watched the MLB network and everything. And then when this happened and they took away the Burlington Royals, and then, even Durham, he's been noticing stuff that, he still goes to the Durham games, but he complains it's becoming more corporate and more homogenous, and, it's not what it used to be. But he's completely sworn off Major League Baseball, and that's the same with some of these other people I got to know. And I mean, these are the if you're talking about a guy that has season tickets to four different teams, that's probably not the person that deserves to be left hanging.
If anybody has any questions too, feel free to drop that in the chat. We'll see if we can get those to Will. I'm curious your take because you were there in North Carolina, and there weren't a ton of North Carolina teams I think that were impacted by the death of the Appalachian League as far as being an affiliate league. I'm curious your thoughts on if Charlotte is the one city I think for North Carolina. Although I think there's a group in Raleigh too that's also trying to make a push to get Major League Baseball. It seems like Nashville in that region is probably the
Mhm.
top city when it comes time for expansion. Do you think a city like a Charlotte or a Raleigh could be really supportive of team number 31 or 32 in Major League Baseball come 2030, 2031, give or take 5 or so years?
Yeah, I mean that's the same rumors that I've heard with Nashville, Charlotte. I hadn't heard Raleigh, but that wouldn't shock me. The Hurricanes hockey team, has a lot of support, and yeah, I mean that's a baseball rich area. I mean college baseball is huge. The ACC down there, just really good baseball. And and then yeah, like the minor league presence down there has always been strong and well supported. And yeah, so that would not shock me to see them get a team. And I think they'd probably, I mean, because there's really nothing, between DC and Atlanta, and there's certainly a lot of people between DC and Atlanta, and a lot of places that have traditionally supported baseball. So I mean, I think that would probably make a lot of sense.
The thing that your book does incredibly well, homestand, small town baseball, and the fight for the soul of America, it creates a mystique in a way surrounding Batavia and that community and the baseball that's there. I don't, it didn't seem like you were trying to do that, but throughout the course of 200 plus pages, you go through the fact that there just aren't any undiscovered talents anymore. There's no more lottery tickets in the 40th round of the draft. There's no future Hall of Famers plying their trade in a stadium with only 2,000 seats anymore. The technology tells us almost everything about who got lucky or who got unlucky on any given play. Is that a big part, do you feel like, of this book or of that community? The fact that again, it's baseball at its purest form in the minor leagues and in summer collegiate wood bat leagues like the Batavia Muck Dogs.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to be at least a little careful not to just kind of fall prey to what a lot of baseball writers do, which is just kind of, and it's hard not to, because we love the game, and you can just become like totally sort of pie in the sky, romantic, and kind of you know, just kind of go too far overboard in that direction where, it just kind of it becomes like a cliche. But at the same time, I was doing another interview and the guy said, there's a reason probably why that happens, that it has that effect on people. They're not just imagining it, like it's actually doing it. Um, uh, and this may not be the right group to, express this thought to, as far as, analytics. Although the more SABR people I've talked to, I realize that it's, maybe my understanding going in is a little different than what a lot of times it seems like you're just baseball fans. It's not like every single member is like, an obsessive, statistical person, despite the name. Um, and so, but I do make I do observe in the book, the fact that like, I think, thinking about like what is at risk of getting lost, I think to my great uncle who was a Brooklyn Dodger fan, and like a lot of fans of that era, growing up, he would listen to the radio in his bedroom, and it was Red Barber was the announcer back then, this famous, announcer. And I went back to actually look at, expressions and the things he would say, and just unbelievably, creative and colorful. And then think down through the years to like Vince Scully, and as an Oriole fan growing up, John Miller, he's on ESPN, did Sunday Night Baseball, and even Bob Costas. There was like a poetry and a creativity and a romance to the games that you would listen to that was like really, could be beautiful. Whereas now, a lot of times you turn on a game and it's like a computer simulation. It's spin, exit velocity, spin rate, just and then like literally like computer simulations of the actual humans on the field, doing something, to illustrate these different the analytical categories that they're discussing. And it's like some of us at least go to the ballpark to like escape technology's onslaught into our lives, not to get even more of it. Uh, the character Bill in the book I write about him, he doesn't even own an iPhone. Not only does he not own an iPhone, he doesn't even own a flip phone. I mean, he's like one of the few people you run into nowadays. And I joked to him that there was this Yankee Stadium was introducing this AI, iPhone, app that was, I don't even know what exactly it was designed to do, like to improve your ballpark experience or something. And he's like, geez, Will, he's like, I don't know, for 100 years, people have been able to get into the ballpark and find their way to buy a hot dog and a beer without AI. Do we really need that? And so, yeah, I am a little concerned that like, is kind of like, is nothing sacred? Do we really need technology to intrude on like every single element of everything that we do?
As somebody who covers baseball professionally and tries to know everything about everything, which is an impossible task, but I still keep trying. There was still something that I learned in this book that I wasn't aware of that has a lot to do with that technology. I did not realize that, despite the Appalachian League and it's now like the MLB Draft League.
Hmm.
And there's a few others out there. I think Major League Baseball still will float some money to help support in
Hmm.
various ways. I didn't realize that MLB was experimenting with AI to the point where like they don't need camera operators, they don't need
Hmm.
directors or producers to record a game, and that was upsetting to read, but also not surprising that they're going that route. And that again, that is part of a lot of the different things that you touch upon on how the game is changing in that way and it's losing its soul.
I mean, the argument, I mean, this is probably of the most interest to at least some of the SABR people, but like, the evolution of just, yeah, like what will the future of the minors look like? And I think there is at least, this prevailing philosophy now, and I don't think it's shared by everyone in the major leagues. I think maybe the majority of owners and general managers, but not all of them. But the general, I think, philosophy is that with the technology we have today, with the analytical prowess, it's a lot more efficient to just send a player, a handful of players down to a facility in Arizona or Florida, run them through like almost like an NFL combine kind of thing, maybe a few simulated games, and to spend, you don't need 100 games a summer in 160 towns with old school scouts, sitting out there with notebooks watching 9 innings, with hundreds of guys. It's an antiquated system. And it's more expensive, obviously. And so that's kind of the dominant strain of thought as to like why we don't need these teams. I think, I think there's some validity to that. I think, other baseball people will push back even against that, and they'll say that there's just some things you can't evaluate even, you can't evaluate in that kind of a controlled setting, and that having an actual game in an actual place, over the course of a season is still the best way to get, a multi-dimensional look at someone's potential. But anyway, that's kind of the debate that's taking place. But none of kind of beyond that is, you know, gets back to our question of, baseball as a business versus, do they owe anything to these places? And is there something, from just a business standpoint, is it helping baseball to make its footprint across America smaller? Like, even if you determine that it's not the most efficient way to get guys to the major leagues, maybe it is still a valuable way to, broaden your reach and remain popular. So in an era where they're worried about, fans getting older and maybe, losing fans, is cutting, your exposure to 40 cities across America the right thing to do?
Yeah, it's financial efficiency. And as you were almost alluding to, there has been some discussion very, very quietly because it's still in the early stages and
Hmm.
there's kind of bigger fish to fry with the CBA expiring after
Hmm.
2026, which
Hmm.
some people are worrying that there's going to be another work stoppage. I know I am.
Hmm.
But as you were kind of touching on, there's been some conversations behind the scenes of going from even 120 down to 90. I think you even do kind of touch on that idea in the book that, hey, you know what, we've got college baseball. I mean, all the other
Hmm.
sports use college as
Hmm.
that platform for guys to jump in as the breeding ground. So let's kind of do that as well. We've got the complex league, so they can just kind of play in the spring training facilities
Hmm.
when it's 120 degrees in Phoenix. We don't talk about that, but we can go from 120 to 90 and still spend the same amount of money. We can pay the guys a little bit more, and it makes us look good for that reason. But at the end of the day, we're still spending the exact same amount of money. Now there's just less opportunities.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and the money's, there. Like we're talking, they saved $700,000 for essentially for per season per team they cut. That's one major league minimum salary. Like we were saying before, I mean, superstars are making that in an afternoon, so does, kind of losing your foundation in like all of Western New York or all of the Rocky Mountains, is it worth saving 700,000? I think it's one of those things that a lot of it comes down to also short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. Yes, your balance sheet is $700,000 better this year, but how's that helping the growth of the sport or the sustainability of the sport 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And that's kind of, not to get go down a rabbit hole, but you see that same kind of thinking in different other industries. Just today, Southwest Airlines, they said how they're going to get rid of the free bags and some of the other customer service things they used to have, and that's probably going to help them, right now and in the next quarter. But how's that going to look 10 years from now, 20 years from now? So it's kind of this short-term profit motive versus the long-term health of your business. And I think baseball is now too much focused on the short term at the expense of the long term.
The book Homestand is very uplifting, very uplifting. But the question that we've got from our president of the Rocky Mountain chapter of SABR, John Salvino, is whether or not this topic, which you had to research, again, I think you paint a beautiful picture about how baseball is still thriving in these places that Major League Baseball has not just forgotten, but has just kind of pushed aside. So the
Mhm.
book, not depressing, but as an author, as a writer,
Mhm.
did it feel depressing because of how you had to go about, researching this and approaching this?
Yeah, a little bit. And that I just saw his message, and it reminded me. I just got an email yesterday that touches on that from that guy in North Carolina, who had the season tickets to the four different teams. And what did he probably said it better. Let's see if I can't find it here, I'll give up. But Um, man, I don't want to waste your time. Yeah, I can't find it right this second. But yeah, that's kind of what he was alluding to. He's just like, it just depresses me, to see some of this stuff happening. And, I used to enjoy those nights at the ballpark so much. And yeah, there was an element of that, that was demoralizing. But then, whenever, if I did get a little dejected, I would then, I'd spend more time in the bleachers with the people that I got to know, in the course of writing the book, and we would still there was still something there that was special, regardless of who was on the field, and I think it brought them and myself, a tremendous amount of happiness. So I'd like to think that, maybe part of that was a little bittersweet, but it was still there. And it was almost, in a sense, almost more special because it's like once something is taken away and once something seems like it's kind of in jeopardy, you appreciate it even more. So I think, maybe before people almost took it for granted that it would be there forever, and now they almost lost it forever, or were confronted with the fact that it would never come back, and now there is something there, and so they kind of treasure it maybe even more than they did before.
Well, my last question, my personal
Mhm.
question. Up to this point, none of these are personal questions. I'm doing the job, right? No, but it got me thinking because again, there are so many different topics in this book that make me want to go down a rabbit hole or learn
Mhm.
more about X, Y, and
Mhm.
Z, right? Batavia, as one of the residents described it, It's got a bowling alley and Mark Twain's grave and the Batavia Muck Dogs, right? So it's got that. But nearby, you said that there was a scene early on in the film, The Natural, starring Robert Redford, who went to CU Boulder. So there's a
I
local
didn't know
connection
that.
there. He didn't graduate from CU Boulder. So his life was ruined after that, after he dropped out of college. So that's really a shame. But it made me think, like,
He
could you
actually went there
create
to
some
play
kind of
baseball.
monument there in the same way that they were able to in Dyersville, Iowa? It's a different movie, it's a different thing altogether, but it sounds like they don't necessarily, no one has capitalized on something like that, whether it's the nearby town or whatever. But was there any discussions or conversations about, like, hey, you know what, this is actually a pretty special place. Maybe we can do something with it.
With with the farm the natural was set on. Yeah, no, I mean, I had no idea. I think I had read that the baseball scenes had been filmed at the old municipal stadium in Buffalo, where the New York Knights, the fictitious New York Knights played. But no, like when this character in the well, he's not a character, he's a real person, Russ Salway, who's a Batavia fan and would host the players in his basement. Back when they were in the minors, he actually hosted, I think, this. Descalso was one of the guys that he got to know. And it's cool. Like Descalso actually invited him to a game when he was on the road visiting Pittsburgh, and Russ drove down with his kid, and Descalso brought him out to dinner. I mean, just a connection of an example of these connections that resulted from having those teams. But no, he's like, yeah, you should check out this farm. That's where Robert Redford was throwing rocks, to the window that Glenn Close was, where she was living or whatever. And I said, I had no idea. I always thought that was Nebraska or Iowa, because I didn't know this part of New York was as agricultural as it was. But yeah, he showed me, we drove right up and saw the farmhouse, and there's someone living there, and we just knocked on the door and said, hey, do you mind if we just kind of look around and take some pictures? And she was totally cool. I mean, everyone, that's what's so great about this book. Everyone was just so welcoming and friendly and yeah, so that was just one fun little anecdote from there.
Homestand is the name of the book. Small town baseball and the fight for the soul of America. This was one of my favorite baseball books I've ever read, and I've read a lot of them. I appreciate you joining us. If there's anything else you want to plug, I'm a podcast host in addition to being a journalist. So this is where you just say, hey, go ahead and plug away. Or if there's anything else you want to add about this book or anything else, the floor is yours.
No, that's it. I mean, please just I'd ask you to pick up a copy. Actually, I used to go up to the Boulder bookstore when I lived in Denver, and I contacted them just because I used to like it, and they said they have the book. They're big. The guy that I talked to is a huge baseball fan, so if anyone's near Boulder, give them your business. Otherwise, you can get it on Amazon or anywhere else. And if you like it, just please help spread the word. That's the challenge for authors like me is just getting the word out. Because the industry now, it's sort of dominated by like the same 20 big names, and it's just hard to break through the noise. So if you see something and you enjoy it, just tell one or two of your buddies or your neighbors, and kind of just like a grassroots campaign is kind of is one of the most effective ones that we can have.
Everybody on this call is going to see themselves in one of the characters in the book. We've got Kurt Wells, who's one of our longstanding board members, in the chat. He was a host family for
Ah,
Charlie Blackmon, Matt Holliday,
oh
a ton
wow.
of guys once they got to the majors. We've had baseball scouts like Tom Wheeler, who's a great member in our chapter. So scouts are going away. You talk about that in the book. We had, as a member for a very long time, a guy who was a former general manager in Major League Baseball, and so many other people that I think can see themselves in the characters in the book, in the jobs and the roles that they have with the Batavia Muck Dogs or in the region. So I think everybody here is definitely going to make a connection with it, and
Great.
we'll enjoy it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you guys for having me. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Will.
All right. Have a good night. Thank you.